Hey, y'all. Thanks for joining us today for Equity in Planning, Elevating Every Voice. My name is Michael Tharrington, and I'm a growth and community consultant with the Ordinal. I'll be your host for today's webinar, and I'm super excited about this discussion we have planned for y'all. Equity is at the core of planning, serving as the essential foundation upon which truly sustainable, resilient, and thriving communities are built. It's about ensuring that every individual in your community, regardless of their background, has access to opportunities, resources, and the power to shape their own environment. This webinar, Equity in Planning, Elevating Every Voice, will explore how intentional, equitable approaches can lead to places where everyone not only belongs, but can
Michael, I think you're muted on my end.
whoops, I might have muted myself there. Sorry about that.
No worries.
All right, well, good to have you with us, Tanya. Could you just introduce yourself for us and tell us a little bit about your experience as an urban planner?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me, Michael. I really appreciate you taking the time out. Hi, everyone. My name is Tanya McGee. I am an urban planner. I've been an urban planner for about 6 years. My journey started after undergrad, just trying to find my next move. I really knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to serve communities and identify different factors that led to marginalized communities, but I really wasn't sure how to go about that. At that point, I didn't even know planning was a thing. So I ended up in a master's program at the University of Albany, where I focused on community planning and urban policy. And that really jump started my planning career. Post completing that, I started an internship in upstate New York, where I was born and raised, and ended up staying there for about 5 years. So started off as an intern to assistant planner to associate planner. And upon leaving local government planning, I did go into consulting for a bit, and enjoyed that as well.
Awesome, that's quite a journey there.
Absolutely.
Well, to go ahead and hop into the meat of what we're talking about today, could you begin by explaining why you think equitable planning is not just important, but really truly essential for thriving communities? And to follow up with that, what are the key consequences when equity is not prioritized during the planning process?
Sure. So I feel that communities only thrive when everyone is heard, regardless of your socioeconomic status, your geographic location within a community, the position that you hold. All input is important to ensure that there is a fair access to services, and just to have a voice in the community and to advocate for yourself. So when you don't see equity in communities, we then see disadvantaged communities. We see communities that are concentrated by poverty and race, essentially violence, right? So when we don't have equity in different places at the table, we see the same communities really served while others just become more disadvantaged.
Tell you what, the mic is just acting a little bit funny right now. Would you mind clicking on the little mic icon at the bottom? Well, I just muted myself. Muting yourself for just a second and then bringing it back in. Sometimes that just equals everything out.
Okay. How about now? Is that any better?
That is, yep, that is. You're back. And it was just fading off slightly, so no big deal there.
Oh, sorry about that.
Nah, no problem. All right, hopping on to the next one. Sorry, I'm not responding to the last one, but hopping on to the next question. What are some of the most impactful historical inequities of the past century in planning that we're still grappling with today here in the U.S.?
The two that come to the top of my head first would be absolutely housing, and second, public health. So, starting with housing, for example, redlining was outlawed in 1968. However, those effects are still seen through the neighborhoods that are marginalized, that don't have access to services, right? So, my dissertation in my PhD program focused on disadvantaged communities, and specifically how race and poverty and segregated communities lead to trauma in those communities. And obviously, the demographics vary, but most often, redlining, although, as I mentioned, it was outlawed so long ago, it's just been, developing into other methods. So we see racial steering, we see predatory lending, we see exclusionary zoning and gentrification. And all of those things still contribute to, these isolated pockets of community. When it comes to public health, especially surrounding planning, the first thing that comes to mind is urban renewal and the construction of highways through these cities. So I was able to participate in a study in Syracuse, New York, looking at I-81. And the portion that they are taking down runs through one of their lowest income census tracts. The concentration of lead poisoning in the city of Syracuse is isolated in that community. And it's just now being something that's being remediated. So I think just those two, and there's probably many more that I could go on a tangent of, but those are two, I think, of the most leading disparities that I see.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, lead poisoning is a super serious too, and to have it isolated in one place.
Yeah, as an asthma as well, right? So the environmental racism that all comes into public health as well.
Absolutely. Well, moving on to the next question, to take a step back, how do you define equity in the context of urban and community planning? Is it about equal outcomes, equal opportunities, or something else entirely?
I would say all of the above. I think that equity is the process of decision making that is intentional. So the outreach has to be intentional. Those that you bring to the table, that has to be intentional to ensure that resources and access are distributed and available to everyone. So I think that equity, the word that I think is most fitting is intentional. I think that a lot of people think, if you have diverse audiences, that's equality or that's equity, and it's not. So being intentional and making sure that every voice is heard, that the stories are told, um, to be able to get that perspective, those that aren't always at the table.
And how do you measure this sort of stuff? Like, what are some of the practical metrics or indicators that planners and data scientists as well are able to use to assess whether their projects and policies or planning projects and policies are truly promoting equity?
I would say you could measure that by your community, more specifically, the partnerships and the participation that you see within your community. So intentional community outreach includes finding like those leaders, those grassroots organizations that already have the trusted communities, so that when we as planners introduce ourselves into a community for a project, people are excited about it and they're involved and they have, a certain momentum going into these projects. And I think that when we go into these communities and we see people that are hesitant, and we see that lack of trust, that's a key indicator that they haven't been considered, their voices haven't been heard, and they haven't been chosen or referred to as the experts in planning their own communities.
Right. Meaningful community engagement is often cited as crucial for equitable planning. In your experience, what are the most effective strategies for engaging diverse and often marginalized voices in planning decisions?
So I know I spoke about this briefly in another question, but going back to identifying grassroots organizations and leaders, that was also a key part of my dissertation. And seeing like, they are the leaders when it comes to filling the gaps that local governments do not. So I know that in planning, we typically go to the stakeholders. So we go to the business owners and we go to, the big names, but ultimately it's the people that are on the ground that are, providing transportation to grocery stores or to church or going to the faith-based institutions that, do after school care. All of those leaders are the people that are most familiar with those that are struggling or those that are most disconnected. So I think that, going back to community engagement, it can also sometimes be seen as just a check. We've done this and we fulfilled it, but it really cannot be one size fits all. I think that it has to be individualized for each community based on their needs and by their experiences. Because a lot of them do, and rightfully so, have a bad taste in their mouth when it comes to planners. Or, these random people from these large companies coming in to, tell them what they need.
What challenges do you generally encounter when trying to ensure equitable participation? And how do you recommend overcoming those challenges?
I would say the number one is distrust. Um, even myself coming into certain communities as a Black woman, if I'm doing work in majority, communities of color, I'm still, if I'm not from that community, I completely understand why there's distrust because I'm ultimately representing a larger company. So I think that there definitely needs to be time taken to show that you are invested in that community, whether that be attending local community meetings and being a familiar face, as well as showing investment through education. So not just going into a community and immediately jumping into the project, but taking time to really intentionally explain the project and the whys and the whos.
Right on. Yeah, I know this wasn't part of the question, but it sounds like there's a level of, putting yourself out there and being approachable to people too. Like
Absolutely.
maybe, trying to develop that as a skill, talking to people and making sure they feel comfortable coming to you. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And that's like one thing that I've done in my career is, when I know that there's a certain project that I'm being put on, go into those meetings and really educating myself as far as like the needs of the community so that, you know, like I said, I'm a familiar face and I can actually have a discussion with these community members and know what they're talking about, right?
exactly. They see you there amongst them too and know you're invested. So it's a good way to build that rapport with them.
Absolutely.
Cool. Um, Access to essential services varies widely and wildly. How can planning actively work to bridge these gaps for underserved populations?
Um, I mean, there's a plethora of ways. Um, I would say identifying key issues, whether it's a barrier to healthcare or transportation, and again, finding those leaders of the communities to find a collaborative approach, I think, right? Everything can't be done in silos. So, um, really finding key players that are able to create solutions that are data informed is very important while also incorporating the lived experiences of the residents in the community.
Gentrification and displacement are significant concerns in many cities. How can the equitable planning principles be applied to alleviate some of the negative impacts while still fostering growth and development?
It's a tricky situation, right? So we want our communities to thrive and to develop, but we also don't want to displace people and put them in situations that are far worse or, than where they are coming from. And I think that that takes a collaborative approach with the residents and being intentional about having them in these meetings and a part of that process because typically these things happen without them, obviously. So one thing that I did um, create as a part of the research was in equity scope, basically. So in New York State, we have like different environmental requirements that we have to do when we do a project to show the environmental impacts, but there's nothing that really shows the impact to the people. And I think that that's one thing, one method that would be helpful. So when like these large projects come in, there needs to be a baseline of how many people are going to be displaced. How many jobs will this create for the people that are existing in the communities, and what protections can we provide for people that are in?
Yeah, I also think like, and sorry, I hope I didn't cut you off there.
No, no, you're fine.
Oh, good, good. I also can see like the benefit of if a place is being gentrified or is growing and is I guess becoming worth more, then another part of it is making sure that the people in your community also see the benefits of that growth and wealth. That you part of it is storytelling to let them know like, hey, this is going to help the value of your place and all. But I wonder if you have any thoughts on that as well about how you kind of share the wealth.
Yes, I to share the wealth, it's so tricky. But I think is coming from a planning perspective, um, when we do our work as consultants and we're entering the community, that needs to be a part of our project planning. It's not something that always local governments are going to think of or developers are going to think of. but it needs to be us kind of leading that charge to just emphasize, these people need to be a part of these benefits that the community is reaping, and whatever policies or practices that can be implemented at the local level needs to be implemented. And, as consultants, we'll be there to help talk through that. Um, but yes, definitely something that should be prioritized.
Well, what are some of the key policy levers or legislative actions that can significantly advance equity in planning at the local or regional level?
So, one conversation that is, I guess, gaining some momentum that I really am finding myself interested in is community impact statements. So, you see these in court, when victims give their statements, but community impact statements in which people that are living in these communities are able to have their stories told, um, to tell, the issues that they're dealing with that we might not see from our level. And I think that that's one key factor that could be very important, whether it be at zoning meetings, planning board meetings, city council meetings, for them to, lead the charge, to tell like a narrative of the disadvantages that they're encountering in their communities.
Right, yeah, attaching humans and their genuine stories to the problems. So,
Absolutely. I think as planners, we function a lot quantitatively, because we're so data driven, but the qualitative stories that tell the entire story is what's really needed. I think when we just depend on numbers and surveys, you know, you're not getting the full story. And it's not very helpful to us because it leaves a large majority of people out of those processes.
yeah, that definitely makes sense. What role do different stakeholders, from local government to developers to community organizations, what do they play? What role do they play in creating more equitable communities? And how can collaboration be fostered between these disparate groups?
I think finding solutions that benefit everyone, that's the easiest way. So I can think of an example. When I was working in Chemung County at the planning department, one of the huge issues that our code enforcement office was trying to navigate was lead poisoning due to our housing stock, right? So the infrastructure is very, very old, lead ridden. The health department also trying to focus on how to navigate that, right? Planning department right in the middle of it. So finding that common goal and trying to understand the roles that each person can play. Again, not operating in silo. I know in local government we can tend to sway that way a lot. Um, but just finding out how solutions to benefit everyone.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Looking for those win-wins, and then it kind of puts people on an even playing field, and they're all for this sort of initiative or whatever it is. Makes
Yeah,
sense.
and not just a one-time thing, but something that can, continue on and, meet frequently, build those relationships with people in different departments. So, as we brainstorm together, we come to other solutions as well.
Nice. Well, could you share an example of a planning initiative or project that you believe successfully championed equity, and what were the key factors contributing to its success?
So the first thing that I think of was the 2020 census. Um, I was pretty much leading that effort by myself, and it was also during a time, it was during COVID, right? So legally, we could not do engagement and outreach as much as we wanted. So during that time, I did look at, where was our low response coming from? And it was from communities of color, non-speaking people, and the elderly, right? And I'm sure that follows national statistics. So I had to really be very unique in how I did this engagement. So rather than, we have the surveyors that go door to door, that's never changed, and, it's never really been effective in our community because there is so much of a distrust, and ultimately, people are just not educated on the census. So um, I decided to create a way for us to do intentional engagement from going into, those spaces. So going into like where the elderly gather, the barbershops, partnering with faith-based institutions, just identifying where these people are that historically have had low responses, and first and foremost, providing education. and then ultimately assisting them in, the census completion. And it was really beneficial. I think that year we did go above our response rate from previously. So I think that's very telling, especially during a time, where we're going through a pandemic.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. And that is one of those things where you could measure it and you could see how successful am I. You could see the numbers growing. And what you said there about, meeting people where they are and helping to kind of diffuse that distrust, that all sounds like really great advice. What are some of the biggest barriers you encounter when advocating for or implementing equitable planning practices?
Um, I think it would be trying to figure out how and say this. I would just say ultimately public bias. Um, so certain words that we use in planning are buzzwords for certain people. For example, like I know we spoke on exclusionary zoning, and there's a lot of people. In the planning world, we call it NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard. So when we say simple terms as affordable housing, there's such a stigma that comes with that. Um, and I think that that's been a huge barrier in just trying to educate people on the benefits of affordable housing and refuting the stigma as well. So just the education, people that want to be educated on it. There's some people that are just, going to be going here, I'm not supporting it, but that's been a huge barrier for sure.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and the stigma against certain words. I mean, I even hesitated when calling this equity in planning because it seems like some people are turned off by the word equity these days. So you do have to tread lightly and kind of, you know, uh, again, meet people where they are and try to use language that's going to bring them in. So,
For sure. Those certain buzzwords are now like, they've become something different, completely different.
right, it's tricky. It's definitely tricky. Um, how can planners navigate, speaking of tricky stuff, how can planners navigate political pushback or entrenched interests that may oppose equitable approaches?
Hmm. I mean, I think it just goes back to education, finding a way to meet people where they are, understanding that, this may, like going back to the example of affordable housing, like this may benefit you also, trying to get them to understand that, you know, these things benefit the community as a whole, like the quality of life for everyone.
Yeah, and when you mentioned earlier too, aligning those interests between people sometimes where you can, getting the people together in a room, letting them tell their story again, like you mentioned, personalizes and puts people, real people in front of other real people. And it's hard to, when you stop looking at each other as just like a vague idea or, something, it really changes the narrative a bit.
Yeah, really like the humanization of these projects. I think that's what really brings understanding, letting people know you have more in common with your neighbors than you think you do.
Absolutely. Look, you co-wrote an article with our founder Jacob called "The Role of AI and Data in Equitable City Development." Can you talk about some of the inherent risk and biases that AI and data can introduce in the planning process if not carefully managed? And how do we go about mitigating them?
Yes. So, because we are essentially feeding the machine with data, there is an inherent bias that comes with it. So, going back to the quantitative part of, data, um, we're not giving a qualitative analysis in someone's life story in the various scenarios. So, when they're just seeing these demographics concerning race, income, etc., it's kind of putting out a one size fits all approach or one size fits all bias when that's not the case. So I think in order to mitigate that, trying to find qualitative ways to feed that data, but also prioritizing those marginalized communities in that data making process, right? That's not something that you can contribute if you haven't lived that experience. So making sure that it's a collaborative approach.
Yeah, that's really good. And I like that you brought up just the bias in some data. We have a phrase in working with AI. It's called garbage in, garbage out. And the idea is if you're feeding a bunch of garbage data into the system that it's using to answer your questions or whatever it's doing, it's going to give you garbage. And if you feed in biased data, it's going to give you biased answers too. So
Absolutely. And I think like in planning, because it's so broad, we touch various areas, housing, public health, criminal justice, etc. Those are like very key factors to the quality of someone's life. Like that can't be something that's just passively done at all.
yeah, well said. Um, Well, I got just a few more questions here, and then we're going to be wrapping up. So I think three more. Can you provide an example of how data analytics and or AI can be used to inform more equitable planning decisions?
Yes. So when correctly done, as you mentioned, I feel like it could be very beneficial for uncovering hidden inequities that we may not be aware of. I think that it could be helpful in predicting risk and even perhaps scenario making. So going back to just planning and like local government, um, giving that individualized data to a certain community, say at the census tract level, I feel like AI would be very beneficial in scenario making and showing indicators that we need to be paying more close attention to.
What kinds of data are most crucial for understanding and addressing inequities? And how can planners ensure that they are collecting and utilizing this data responsibly?
So I'll start with responsibly, making sure that, I know that we emphasize the importance of collaborating with these residents, but making sure that one, their data is protected, and two, that they are benefiting off of sharing their experiences and sharing their data. Um, I think demographic wise, health access, housing, transportation access, poverty, um, all of that, I think, just the key indicators to the social determinants of health in the built environment, I think, are key to uh, reading those assessments.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, there's so much data there. There's school district data. There's all of this sort of stuff that could play into equitable access. I think about like when I look at GIS Esri, and I look at how places are zoned, and you could pull up a place and you can see the school district it lies in, and various information like that, and it all plays into how much access these people have. So
Yeah, I'm actually working with a professor in upstate New York, and he is currently researching housing covenants across upstate New York. So even something like that, when you think of place in the built environment, when you have these housing covenants that where it was blatantly written like you could not sell to a person of color, and looking and seeing how those neighborhoods vary from communities of color, like that's also very important. I think we need to understand, the contrasts community by community, and show in the future like where we really need to invest. I know that like a lot of funding is given to downtowns and then it's leaving, these isolated pockets disadvantaged. So I think there's just a lot that we really need to reconsider as planners and a lot that we need to prioritize.
um, well, we're at our final question here, so we'll look to the future for this one. So, looking ahead, what do you see as the greatest potential for AI to positively impact equitable planning, and what needs to happen for us to realize this potential?
I think that AI can play a key role in, oh, there's just so much. I feel that as we do, I think specifically me, because my research and my passion is neighborhoods, I think that there's such a lack of data at the neighborhood level and at the census tract level. So I feel like really individualizing that data would directly benefit those people living there. I think a lot of times as planners we focus on like county level, municipal level, but I think that this has the potential to really dig into these neighborhoods at that level and serve those people directly.
Yeah, I think you're right too, and it can work on that more granular sort of level because I mean, there's only so many hours a planner has in the day to really dig that deep into the data, I think. And if you could have algorithms that can really look at, say, like we were just talking about, looking at kind of cross-referencing a town's code with GIS and sort of seeing like, okay, this is where a lot of these people are not having access to, or are out of range of most of our commercial buildings, or aren't able to go to the nicest schools in the area. You can use all of this to kind of dig down into different neighborhoods and compare and contrast the access that they have to different
Yeah,
services. So I see a lot of potential there as well.
I think that because like we can see the data from neighborhood to neighborhood, and we can see that this neighborhood that is only 10 miles from this neighborhood has a lower life expectancy rate. I think that calls for intentional planning, and I think that AI could produce individualized plans and comprehensive plans for communities.
Totally, yeah. No, that's a really good idea. Well, Tanya, thank you so much for coming. This is, that's all the questions that we had for today, and just really appreciate you hopping on and participating in this interview.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And for any viewers, today's conversation didn't specifically discuss our AI assistant Ordinal. You may have realized at the end we were talking about AI quite a bit, but we didn't discuss Ordinal. But we'd love to tell you all more about our software if you're interested. A colleague of mine dropped a link to our website and YouTube channel. So if you'd like to take a demo of Ordinal, please just message us. I think we also dropped a link to Tanya's LinkedIn account, so please connect with her as well if you'd like to chat with Tanya. And yeah, thank you all for joining us this Friday. I know Friday webinar is funny timing, so thank y'all for hanging out, and hope you enjoyed the talk. Hope you have a wonderful weekend. All right, see y'all.
Thanks, everyone.